Hi, and welcome to the Cult of Crafting. My name is Michael, and in this video I'll show you how to make a pool of toxic waste out of a picture frame. This is one of the simplest builds I've made on this channel, yet somehow I still managed to screw it up. More on that later. We're gonna use a Ninja picture frame from Ikea to make our toxic waste pool. It doesn't have to be this particular frame, but I think it has a good size, and I'll recommend that you find a frame with a similar edge. The idea is to use the frame as the surrounding edge of the pool. I'll paint the backing board in toxic colors and use the glass to create reflections to sell the effect of the toxic waste being a liquid. I was pretty stoked about this idea. I removed the backing and made a new one out of thick cardstock. You could use the original backing instead and just stick a piece of paper in between the backing and the glass. I wanted to make hazard stripes for the edge of the pool. Since yellow is problematic to paint over black, I primed the frame white. And at this point I had already messed up. Can you guess what I did wrong? You'll see in a moment. After I primed the frame white, it was easy to get a nice yellow coat of paint. Then I added masking tape to make the hazard stripe pattern, placing the first piece of tape in a corner at a 45-degree angle, and using another piece of tape to evenly space the hazard stripes. Finally, I gave the frame a coat of charcoal black to create the dark lines. Then it was just a matter of peeling off the tape to get the perfect hazard stripes. The masking tape ripped the paint off the frame. I think the mistake was to spray prime a glossy surface. I should have sanded it before priming it to give the paint something to grip onto. At that point I could either scrap the project, sand the frame and start over with the painting, or I could move on and try to cover up the damage. Being both stubborn and lazy, I chose the final option. Step 1 was to do what I should have done from the start and sand the original paint. I tried to remove any loose flecks of paint and avoid damaging the paint that was left. The next step was to ensure that the rest of the paint and my continued work wouldn't just peel off the frame later on. I figured that the paint varnish I had wouldn't be enough to get the job done, so I decided to cover the entire frame in a layer of thinned down PVA glue. Hopefully that would lock everything down. It should also give the following layers of paint something to hold on to. The plan was to make all the damaged areas look like they had corroded, so I grabbed a bunch of paint to make rust effects with. I started by applying a rust texture paint from Vallejo. It's a dark brown mixed with some fine grit. It's kinda like Typhus Corrosion from Games Workshop, but coarser. In hindsight, I wish I had also used something more coarse with the texture paint, like sand or baking soda, so I would have had a mix of textures. After the texture paint had dried, I took a variety of brown and orange colors. With a piece of sponge, I stippled the paints on the terrain to add some color variation and to add to the look of the rust having some texture. I painted on a heavy layer of orange and browns on the texture paint and went lighter on the hazard stripes because I wanted them to look worn and dirty, but I didn't want to cover them up completely. There was a bit of yellow left where the paint had peeled. I tried to preserve that when I was doing the weathering. The colors I'd chosen didn't quite do it for me, probably because there wasn't enough contrast between the browns and the charcoal black hazard stripes. Besides stippling, my other go-to technique for painting rust is to make a thin orange wash and apply it to the piece. Now, if I was just making this for myself, I would have reached for the enamel paints and pigments and oils, but I'm guessing most of you don't have that in your arsenal, so I'm trying to show you how I'd go about making rust with normal acrylic paints for miniatures or craft paints. Since I wanted to make the rust brighter, I chose two orange colors, mixed them with some water and applied them all over the terrain. I used clear water to fade the effect to avoid stains with sharp edges. This looks quite vibrant when it's applied. As it dries it becomes more muted, so it can be difficult to predict how much of an effect it'll have. But usually it's less dramatic than it initially looks. The final step was to stipple some metals on the terrain piece. The metal really helps sell the effect that it's rust and not just some dirt, especially if you're using colors that are more dark brown than bright orange. For the toxic waste, I wanted to take advantage of the fact that it was detached from the rest of the piece, so I could actually switch it out when I wanted to. So I decided to paint each side of the backing cardboard in different colors, green on one side and purple on the other. I used my airbrush, but you could use wet blending or dry brushing instead. In both cases I started with a mid-tone and I darkened the edges and moved towards a warmer color in the center. For the green side I used a bright green as a base, then a dark green for the edges and yellow mixed with a bit of the base color for the center. In hindsight I should have started with the yellow because it has less coverage and worked my way out from there. On the other side I used a magenta where I added some blue for the edges and reddish orange for the center. I hope this guide was helpful. If you want more tips for crafting, join the cult by subscribing to the channel. If you want to see more builds from me, check out this video. If you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, leave them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.